Preamble, Amy.
Okay, here's a preamble. Let's try this one out. Gainey and I just wanted to co-curate with a couple of fascinating and favorite people. And so I invited Sarah McCarron to this wonderful discussion, and Gainey invited Nikki Yeboah. And we are really thrilled to have both of you here with us in this room to discuss what we think is going to emerge as something around female writing in these times, with some idea about female protagonism being, and Gainey, you also were bringing in the idea of caretaking. What is it to caretake, and how is witnessing a form of caretaking in times that could be considered apocalyptic, could be considered not apocalyptic, but just really full of change. What does apocalypse mean? It's the revelation of something secret. So it's times of revelation, something's changing, something new is being revealed. But basically it's just really a chance to talk with you, because you're both incredible people. And we'd really love it if people in the room could come onto camera and even unmute, because it is such a small group that we anticipate that it could be a real conversation. So if you can manage that, it would be great. Don't worry how you look. I don't care how I look. I just arrived back from a 3-day flight via Singapore. So it's all good. We're being recorded, but so what? Everything is recorded nowadays. The world is so full of recordings that nobody has any time to watch any of them. So it doesn't really matter. And we will stop recording probably, right? And Gainey, we'll stop for 45 minutes. So if there's anything really hot topic you want to bring up that you don't want to be recorded talking about, you can do that after we've stopped recording.
Now, the format generally is that the conversation lasts about an hour to an hour 15, and then we carry on after that. And until people are tired and don't want to kind of sit around the water cooler anymore. So there's a kind of formal chat, then a more informal second half. Sarah does have to, if I'm not mistaken, has to leave within the hour, right?
Possibly not. I'm waiting to hear if not. Yeah.
Great, flexible endings. I love it. So let's record the first 45 minutes, Amy. 45 minutes. Cool. Yeah, and then last 15 is open-ended stuff you don't necessarily want recorded for posterity, but that you want to say anyway. Yeah, and of course, as Amy said, this is a conversation rather than a seminar or a presentation. The idea really is that we were really interested in having you from your respective kind of areas of expertise that are related to kind of speak around this issue of what it is to be women writing in times of crisis, but also writing about women in these particular moments. I guess as good a place as any to begin might be to ask you to just briefly introduce yourselves. Tell us a bit about your work, and then I'm going to probably follow up with, I'm interested in really hearing about how you arrive at the stories that you are interested in telling. Yeah.
I can begin. My name is Nikki Yeboah, and I'm a professor at the University of Washington of playwriting. And I do documentary theater, which is theater based on interviews and archival footage. And so I mostly do work around, that's close to me, either in proximity or to my heart, which means I often do work about Black women or Black people. My most recent play was Akosua Goes Home. My mother, after many years of living in Canada where I was raised, went back home to Ghana to retire. And my sister, myself, and her did a kind of introspective dive into our years in Canada together. So I would interview them both apart and together. And it was just a pulling apart of our family history. And kind of also, it was a pulling apart. It began as it was going to be a straight up oral history with my mother, but all of her memories were our memories. There was no way I could not feel or respond to what was being said. And it was true for my sister as well. So it became this look at how we remember what we remember. And yeah, so that's my most recent work. But the work that M knows better is The Mothers, which were oral histories conducted with women who've lost their children to police violence. That came out in 2018 and circulated quite widely in the States, at least. And that's more political in nature and had to do with me reflecting on my move from Canada to the States. What were the things that were worrisome to me? And so that was the basis of that. And so, yeah, I think that's good for the intro. Awesome. I'll pass it on.
Hi, I'm Sarah McCarron. I am primarily these days a television writer. I come from theater, devised ensemble, physical theater, and currently am working on adapting a memoir called Untamed by Glennon Doyle. And before that, worked on a show called Station 11, which is currently streaming on HBO Max, and just a bunch of other TV stuff. But I also do playwriting and performance practice, and I teach movement as well. Yeah.
Nice. So already, you both kind of have a very specific kind of place where you seem to emerge from in your shall I call it storytelling. How do you arrive at the kinds of choices you make about which stories are important to tell and why those stories might be important to tell? Because it seems, I mean, Nikki, you spoke about this kind of collective memory, if you will, within the family, but that is kind of embodied by your mother and then kind of taking that forward. And Sarah, certainly there's this kind of tension between the personal within this kind of broader collective memory structure of society as well. So there's kind of interplay between the personal, the political, the individual as part of a collective. Yeah, there's this lovely way that those kind of rub up against one another. In both of your work. So I'd be interested in hearing a little more about, what drives you to tell the stories you tell.
Yeah. I actually majored in undergrad in television writing in Toronto. And I remember one of the questions that I would get asked often was, who's your audience? Because I wanted to write these stories about like West African families, and this was a different era. and they would always ask, who's going to watch this? Who's your audience? And they thought it was productive advice. But that caused me to stop writing for many years because I thought that there was no audience for my work. What was freeing to me about entering theater as a space was, especially because I entered it as an academic, as opposed to sort of industry. And so what was freeing for me was I didn't have to consider my audience. I could consider myself and the stories I wanted to hear. And that's where I begin. What do I want to hear? What do I want to talk about? And the stories emerge from there. And I find that doing it that way, I have found an audience. It's not, the audience finds you. You don't have to go looking for it always. And so I start with the stories that matter to me, that are top of mind, that are pressing up against my heart. The Mothers happened because I found out someone had been killed by police on the campus that I worked at. And no one was talking about this. And I was like, how is it possible? It was supposed to be a community piece for us to reflect. But obviously this is happening in so many communities across America that it grew beyond that scope. But originally it was just I can't believe this community is not talking about this. I'm going to interview some people. I'm going to make a play and it'll run for 2 days in the Bay Area and no one will have heard of it. And then it continued from there. So there's something freeing about writing what I want to hear, what I feel like is not talked about, what I feel like needs to be out there, and then starting from there.
And just for my own clarity, when you started working on The Mothers, this was just prior to the kind of big George Floyd moment, if you will, right? With a part of the
Yeah, but it was
national
post the 2014-15 BLM movement. I was offered the job in 2015. That was when it was at its peak. And one of my biggest concerns and the biggest concerns of my family was, do you really want to live in a place, you know, where you don't feel safe? And then I chose California, ironically, because I thought it was the most liberal state. And then through my research, found out it actually has like extremely high rates of incarceration, some of the highest rates of police murders in the country. Like, I don't know, it was something like 7 of the top 11 of the most like murderous police forces are in California. So it was just like, what did I do? And that's where it emerged from a sense of really deep fear and panic.
The myth of California is so fascinating to me. It's incredibly interesting because it's like Republican for a very long time. And it's like, so there's so many pockets of talk about conservatism, but yeah.
And conservatism of all kind, like so many pockets of wealth. So like wealthy conservative people, because we've got Silicon Valley, we've got Hollywood, right? Yeah. And then so many pockets of like rural farm areas, because it's like the breadbasket of the United States. Yeah.
And did you see what just happened yesterday in LA with the LA, right? The like elite progressive bastion of Hollywood, blah, blah, blah. They just made encampments illegal for folks who don't have homes. And it's absolutely like, it's horrifying. I mean, it's like thousands and thousands of people who are now, and in all of the response to it against this law that's just passed, the thinly veiled language reveals that, oh, this isn't about, they're like, you know, the feedback is this is not going to solve homelessness. And then the response to that is, actually, that's the point, is not to solve homelessness. It's to protect children going to school from the trauma of seeing the encampments. That is the logic of the law. It's really, yeah, California.
Well, I guess there's something, charming is the wrong word, but something that one can take away, at least there's some kind of level of honesty in that rhetoric, in a way that there often isn't within, you know, this kind of neoliberal world where you kind of proffer the promise of a kind of liberal outlook and these liberal investments, but actually you're deeply embedded in and are sustaining a kind of conservative kind of frame of the world. So I appreciate the honesty of.
Oh, I wish it felt more honest. I think that's like that's the like subtext. I think it's quite dishonest because like they're not coming out and saying we don't care about these people. They're saying we care about protecting the kids from seeing them, from you know. Anyway, sorry, it's off topic.
Apologizing the homeless.
I mean, I think this is, I think it's not off topic in the sense that we wanted to ask about your reaction as writers to what we might call conservatism. And you know, Nikki, you've I think wonderfully, you know, said you write what you would like to hear discussed. So this is like a one way to think about it in a way is just, you know, the reaction is right there. But also this question of like, what is conservative? What are we conserving? So obviously, what I want to conserve and Sarah, your work with Station 11 speaks to the museum of civilization, the things that we value, that we want to see transmitted and preserved, versus the conservatism of wanting to conserve a certain narrative, a certain way of looking at things, a certain pristine perspective on, you know, on what life in California should, how things should look. So just would you be interested in teasing out a little bit how conservatism functions in your universe as writers, especially American conservatism, because you're both located in the United States?
Yeah. I love that question. I don't even think I've thought of that question, like really. And just to kind of add to the notion of writing about what we want to hear, I think one reason I gravitated towards television writing is, and this sort of answers the first question too, in relation to your next question, is in thinking about what stories to work on is what do I want to see? Because it's such an image-based medium, and that whole, you know, question of who's the audience, who's going to watch this. Yeah. That is such an enraging story that you told, Nikki, and also such an important kind of like crack. I think of like, you know, even how can we shift the culture of making television or media in any way such that that question becomes not the question that's being asked. And I do actually think it is changing a little bit, not enough, but there is a kind of awareness of how messed up that question is. And I think there are more and more creators who are just like, and this has to do with just the proliferation of streaming and just the whole business model is such that there are more and more creators that are like, I don't care about Nielsen ratings. Here's what I want to see. And like, let's just get it seeable. And then audiences can find that. And that's related to conservatism too, because it's like, conservatism in the content of the material, what the values of the characters are, what the values of the world that's being built narratively are, and then what the values of the system creating the content are, and how do you navigate that system in a way that plays by enough of the rules you can actually get something made, but also flouts the rules enough that you can actually get something of worthwhile made. Yeah. And I guess I love the question. I've always thought if I had any kind of like unifying idea behind the projects I do, it has to do with being subversive. But that's kind of just corollary to like it's the opposite of conservatism, sort of. I don't know if that answers the question. It's a little like vague, but yeah. And then I can talk specifically if you wanted at some point about like certain stories, like whether it's Station 11 or whatever, but yeah.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, because you didn't get a chance to answer that question, Dave's question about how you find your way into your writing. I mean, how you orient. I mean, you've answered that a little bit. Is there anything further you'd like to say about how you pick your projects? And
I think it has just to do with like, what is the potential to see, what images will this story yield that we haven't seen or that we need to see, or that are being that are not allowed to be seen, or that are being hidden or kept invisible, you know, and also that's one thing. And then also like, what's the it's such a collaborative medium. So it's like, I mean, as theater is too, it's just like, what's the nature of the collaborative? I guess what I love about it is it's like in choosing material and projects is the seed powerful enough to yield something that's going to be a new kind of horizon of imagery, I guess, that actually liberates more people or has the potential to. That's a lofty idea, but, and then is the team, the creative team, collaborative enough to sort of go in and create something that nobody yet knows what is going to be created, if that makes sense. And it's a total miracle that anything gets made, but then if something actually gets made that has a vision that is coherent, I kind of just love the long odds of it. It's like, it's so yeah, it has to do with what, I mean, genre wise, I'm sort of agnostic, and I love, and this comes from the Lecoq training, Amy, of just exploring all these different theatrical territories and the movement of different territories. So I love going from, like, recently just worked on, you know, like a 1950s kind of spy. I love going into clear kind of tropey genres so far that you can come out the other side and subvert it and create something, a new space. I'm sort of obsessed with having just recently seen Nope. I don't know if people have seen it. Have you seen it? Anyone seen it?
I haven't yet.
No?
I haven't seen it yet. I'm going to see it, I want to say next week. I'm traveling, so I'm going to see it next week when I get back.
Okay, well, we might have to have a
good things.
I know, I mean, that's the thing, right? Like, when you see it, hopefully you like it, but it's just, you know, whoa, it's like a Western and it's a monster movie and it's all these things, but it's nothing anyone has ever seen before. But it's like and maybe that has to do with the conservatism question. Like, how do we kind of invoke the narratives that we've grown up in enough that we kind of like have some orientation, and then completely pull the rug out from that orientation, thereby questioning the narratives we've grown up in, I guess.
Yeah, that's great.
You know what? While you're talking, I'm kind of thinking about this difference or similarities between TV or kind of the cinematic mode and theater as a kind of live mode. And I'm wondering how the medium firstly shapes the way you, naturally as it would, right, the way that you choose to tell those stories. But more interestingly, do you feel that you are better able or do the work differently, right, of pulling that rug out in one medium versus the other, because of the kind of practice of spectatorship that television, for example, calls for as opposed to the theater? And I'll tell you what I mean is that I think, Sarah, you said, you know, for example, we've arrived at a point where the industry, if you will, has changed so much that there's less pressure to conform to the kind of formal networks of circulation and distribution that have grounded most TV production up until this point. We have this kind of online space where I think you can find a much more diverse audience. Whereas I feel that as that theater, okay. Whereas in some ways I think that theater is still trapped in the need to get bums in seats, right? To get people physically there to come together. Yeah, I wonder if you'd speak a little about yeah, those differences or similarities in what each mode that you work in confers, I think, on your ability to do this rug pulling work, the leaning into the genre, but also refusing us the comfort, I think, of not questioning those genres that we tend to be grounded in.
Do you want to take that, or you want me to answer that first?
I felt it was more addressed to you in the last comment, but
both.
I
Sorry, I'm
feel
also trying to handle the sound at the same time.
I actually feel the opposite of M, in that I found theater to be a much less risk-averse space than television. But that's because, you know, I left television young. So I actually want to hear your perspective, Sarah, about what the industry is like today.
I
But
completely agree. It's
yeah.
the opposite. I think that, well, I didn't mean, go ahead. I don't want to cut you off.
Yeah, no, I just think that theater can be done in front of 5 people. Theater can be done in front of 5,000 people. And so you get to really try stuff out. There are fringe festivals, there are like theater companies just pop up. And so I do feel like because, television is high budget, film is high budget, even if it is on a streaming network, they still want, and theater does too, but theater is also like quite aware of the risks involved financially. We don't rake in millions of dollars per production, so our expectations are lower for the kind of monetary return, which means that people really get to take chances. And in places like South Africa, I know Canada is the same. The United States less so. The government is much more generous with its funding of these art forms than in the States, for example. So I do think that if you do want to make things that are weird and different and break things open, theater is where you go. Still, I think it's still the more innovative medium.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that it's more and more possible in television, but that doesn't mean it's very possible in television. It's like, whereas theater by nature is that, and that is theater, right? That's the whole point. Like, and especially now, I mean, as it, and you can do it for nothing, and you can do it for 2 people, and you can, and there's just like, and I constantly have an arm and a leg and performance practice and like constantly devising theater, and will never not do that. That's why I say it's sort of a weird, I don't know what the masochistic or something. There's a kind of like Sisyphean weird love of how impossible television is. Because then you have things like, like, I mean, I really, really am proud of Station 11. I think that is a show that is doing something that is not easy to do, and operating on levels that, like, if that's possible, then let's keep trying to do that. And, Hiro Murai directed that, and he does Atlanta, and he does, he just was an EP on The Bear. And these are shows that are like, yeah, let's see more of this, let's have the world have collective conversations about these things. And so that long odds possibility of getting to make television like that keeps me kind of into it, for sure. But I've, for every one of those shows, I personally worked on and watched dozens die because you are subservient to the corporate overlords giving you notes. I mean, just honestly, to get Miranda in Station 11 to be a Black woman, like, there's millions of stories there that I could share that are just like, because she's not in the book, she's a white woman from Canada, and that happened because an incredible writer named Shannon Houston, Pat Somerville, the showrunner, wanted Shannon to work on the show, and Shannon was like, love the idea, I'm not interested in working on shows that don't have Black women as the lead, bye. And Pat was like, wait, what's possible? And she's like, make Miranda a Black woman. He's like, great, let's do it. And so that began, and she's the center of the show. She's the author of the seminal text in the world. And so what does that do to the entire, just that alone to me, like, is an amazing revolutionary possibility. And the fact that it was executed so stunningly by Danielle Deadweiler and all these incredible reverberations, and yet still, I don't want to go into all of it, but like, there's complications, and all along the way, there's notes from networks, and there's blind spots, and there's really, I don't really want to go into all that on a recorded thing, but you know, it's not easy, and it's way more than not easy. It's completely fucked up. And so, yeah, that tension between like how incredibly hard it is, and that's a success. And then you see, then you'll bear witness to just the death of so many projects, or the even inability to get them started because of the failure of imagination of people who are serving corporate interests, is absolutely why theater is much more of a space for safe and free experimentation.
Ngani, is it okay if I ask my favorite question? I crafted this question, like I kind of spitwad over the weeks. So if like, so I like the idea that might be a genre called apocalyptica, in the sense that there's something that is changing, that is so drastically going to be so drastically different that we could conceive of one world ending and a new world beginning, whether or not that apocalypse follows the conservative Christian idea of apocalypse or whatever. But if there is something like apocalypse, and this is what I'm not sure about what you would think of this, Nikki, in terms of, it's pretty clear that Station 11 is an apocalyptic sort of narrative. But if you just entertain the idea that there's this idea of like something changing radically, that you are that you're picking up on, that you've got, you know, what you, Nikki, want to hear, what you, Sarah, want to see is a kind of new world that might be emerging. If that's the case, is there something really good or useful about a female protagonist? You know, or is, Nikki, you're writing from interviews and documentaries. I mean, and I'm not sure if you are inclined more towards female protagonists or female stories, but just, you know, the question is really for both of you, and so I've just crafted that one over my long haul flight, in which Station 11 was one of the 6 shows featured on Qantas. By the way, Sarah, just to say, one of the 6 was, but of course it's also up for 7 Emmys, so that's one of the reasons. It's an unusual show. Okay, so I'll shut up.
If you're still wrapping your heads around that, may I add to that rather delicious question? Because
no, that's going to complicate it. We're still wrapping our heads around that.
But Nikki, this is specifically because I think it'll help with the wrapping. I also wonder if in this framing of the apocalypse, we might think about apocalyptic in 2 different temporalities. By which I mean, there's the sense of things are falling apart now. But when I look at, for example, the kinds of stories that I've certainly encountered of yours, Nikki, it's like things have been unraveling for a long time, right? So things have always already been apocalyptic, usually for Black women or for these people who kind of live in crisis all the time. So I wonder if there's a way of thinking about apocalypse not necessarily as a spectacular immediate moment, but that there's a kind of lengthier, stretchier version of the apocalypse as well as the immediate. That's it. Continue rapping.
I appreciate that. I would say I've never thought of this question before, but I think it's really fruitful. So I'm gonna try to engage it, and then I'll probably re-engage it with further thought. But there's something about interviewing women about events that affect us all that reveal, you know, events land differently on women's bodies. Even in the case of, when I think about like an apocalypse, this is very strange, but I've been watching this show called Alone, which is a show where people on purpose are sent to a middle of nowhere destination and they have to survive alone with nothing but their wits about them. So they have to hunt and forage their own food. They have to build their own shelter, all of this stuff. And it's about who survives the longest. And people often, you know, just lose their minds because you're alone, nothing. Just you and the camera that you bring with you. Anyways, I often watch that show And I look at the female contestants and I'm like, but what happens when you menstruate? You know, like they have these fears around like a bear is going to sniff the blood of the meat that I killed, and then the bear is going to maul me. And I'm thinking, but what happens when you're menstruating? It's going to smell that. How are you going to, you know, what if you get cramps? What if you, and so I'm just thinking about like, even, you know, men and women are experiencing this voyage together, but it'll land differently on the women's bodies. They often starve faster because they have less body fat. They have less strength to pursue some of the big game that is necessary. You know, like they just have to approach, women have to approach things differently, and crisis lands differently on women's bodies. This thing with these interviews with the mothers that I did, right? We've heard of police violence before. I think what struck a chord in people was that I'm now talking to those that gave birth to a child that is no longer here because they've been taken by this system. And the play was about them. It wasn't about their children, so to speak, you know? It was about their experience of that, a mother's experience of that kind of loss. So while a lot of police violence is committed against Black men, it has an effect on the women in that community. And the women's experience of it opens up a different window into their humanity. The men that we've lost, the women's experience of that loss opens up a window into their humanity. It opens up the window into their childhood. It opens up the window to allow us to access a kind of empathy that unfortunately, you know, men are not afforded at times, you know. And so I'll continue to think about this question, but I guess to sum it up, I do think that women's experiences of historical events are, you know, under talked about, absolutely, and also experienced in ways that we can't fathom because we don't think about it, because it's not considered. And so it retells similar stories, but from a very different perspective. Yeah.
Yeah. What's the question? All right. I think I know what the question is. I really appreciate the question and the follow-up to the question, because I think about this so much. Like, I also think the notion of apocalypse, end of the world, as one thing is not unrelated to like the problems of patriarchy. Like, because it makes invisible the daily horrors and apocalyptica that is required to sustain this situation we're in. For the people to have power, to continue having power. So, you know, that's a value of centering apocalyptic stories on women, is to actually just kind of question this, it's the end of the world, right? It's always the fucking end of the world. And like, always, you know, I think about this, like, you know, and I appreciate you bring up the menstruation, because I think, like, what would the world be like if men hemorrhaged from the center of their body blood every month? Like, just think about that. And we can't talk about it. We can't, it's like this, and then you don't, like, not even getting into all the other implications around childbirth and you know, like, there is this myth that like we are in a world that would be bad if it ended, right? That's like, it's a myth on both sides, because the world is always ending for so many people all the time that get invisible. But then also that's part of the argument of Station 11 too. Like, would it be so bad? Would it be so bad if this situation stopped and we could be different in the world? It's just kind of what comes to mind. And I know, like, so specifically with Station 11, the whole notion and origin of the purpose of the show was, we want to do a post-apocalyptic, an optimistic post-apocalyptic show. So not The Walking Dead, not a show that whose motor is violence or vengeance or zombie apocalypse. And so that's born in the book that Emily St. John Mandel wrote, the novel. That is the heart of the book, is really that, you know, what the kind of traveling symphony that, you know, that this flu kills most of the world and capitalist civilization collapses. What's left 20 years later in this new landscape, there's a traveling symphony of theater makers who go around telling stories to whomever has survived. And it's, you also can't have apocalypse without a rebirth. That's the flip side of it. It's always happening, and therefore things are always being born and reborn and reborn and reborn. And I think centering stories on women allows a kind of like reset to kind of to allow for that movement in stories. So it's not, and also okay, now I know what I want to say is there's something in the Western canon which is super fucked up, which is the hero's journey, right? Like, you map the hero's journey out, and it is this one single white dude who is, you know, got the quest and got the obstacles, and we don't get the vantage point of the people who are the obstacles, right? And then the climactic action, and then the fall. And what really, when you're mapping that out, it is literally a male ejaculation. That is literally this, it's a sexual, you know, and even that is like completely not taking, if you think about the erotic of storytelling, or the kind of like giving birth of storytelling, when you look at the sort of, you know, women's sexuality or women's eroticism or giving life or creativity, it's cyclical. It's not a linear one beginning, one end, right? It's a whole different movement pattern. It's a whole different orientation to space and time and beginnings and ends. And that's exciting. And I think we need more of those kinds of stories that not only center women, but in centering women actually allow the decentering of only one subjectivity, so that you have kind of more ensemble storytelling, and you have more switching into different subjectivities that don't all see the world in the same way, and getting rid of this idea that there is just like one world and one hero, and I'm going to save that world, and then I'm going to validate myself in that world, because that's the structure of so many of the stories that are like we've been breathing since we've been born, and before that. And it's not true, and it's boring, and it's harmful.
Yeah, the erotics of storytelling. That's a whole other conversation that I'm definitely going to have with myself. Yeah, thanks, Sarah. But the other thing I'm thinking along those lines, and the hero's journey and the figuring usually of the hero in a kind of masculine figure, is that everyone works and serves the hero, whether they're an obstacle or somebody who's kind of ushering them along the road, including the women, right, around them. But in those kinds of same sorts of scenarios, and I guess this is kind of tacking back to one of the things that we highlighted in the description of the discussion, is the kind of role that women tend to be figured in those scenarios as helpmates, as you know, the plus one who's adjacent to, though not an agent in, the making of that story, of that history, of that new possibility, whatever it might be, is that women tend to be relegated to the role of caretakers, right? They heal the wounded warriors when they come back home. The
Or
question,
property.
sorry?
Or property.
And always constitutes as such. And I guess if there is something that I find very kind of what's what I'm looking for? Generative about this recentering of women is to not only mark the fact that historically they've tended narratively to serve the function of caretakers, who are there waiting by the hearth, as it were, but it's to also make possible, I think, a different kind of rendering of women as agents. Maybe part of that is in recognizing the very thing that I'm being a bit dismissive of now, which is domesticity, of caretaking, and that sort of thing, is recognizing that as a valuable labor in and of itself. And to not dismiss it, but to recognize that there's some kind of gender differential here about how we perceive heroes versus their kind of attendants, right? Thought. Not gonna say anything.
Sorry, just before you speak, Nikki, I just want to ask, is this the right moment to stop recording? Would we like that to happen now? Is this good?
Thank you. I had lost track of that. Yeah, we are at the end of the recorded portion of the talk, but yeah. Continue.
Would that be okay, Falguni? Thank you.
Thanks, Falguni.